Good morning and welcome to the Stop and Think webinar, first of a series of webinars talking about the fact that traditional FM thinking is now dead and driven out by the COVID-19 scenario. So I guess with no further ado, just cracking on, a bit of an introduction. Stop and Think has its origins based in two organisations: Opel Management Services Limited, which is a UK-based pan-European consultancy, been going on now for 28 years. Only operates in the FM arena and tends to work in private sector only, and also is FM, as I say, FM only, private sector, pan-European, blue chips predominantly. Turning over to Alan, my colleague, to just take you through Chainstone.
Okay, good morning. Chainstone's been in existence for about 11 years now, but our principals and our associates have many years of business experience. Our strapline is from ideas to management solutions. We offer clients tried and tested implementation processes for complex and critical change projects, grounded in FM and property, but we're able to apply our techniques across a wide range of business needs. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. So the combination of these two organisations created a think tank, and the think tank we branded as Stop and Think. And this started right at the beginning of the COVID process. And the think tank consists of effectively 5 people. There's myself, and I'm the founder director of Opel Management Services. My colleague, Nick Marsh, who's not on the webinar today, and Derek Winton you can see on your screens as we speak. Alan with Chainstone, and Stuart Mitchell, his colleague, who's not on the call unfortunately today. So those 5 people have been spending a great deal of time understanding or trying to understand the implications for FM of what we're seeing in terms of the pandemic, but also the rules that are governing the pandemic introduced by governments worldwide. It is UK-centric, a lot of the detail that you will hear today, and some of the statistics, or most of the statistics, are based on the UK forecasting, economic forecasting, and so forth. But the principles are global. The same principles are applying in most organisations pan-globally and in countries. So a little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind, first off, which is how do we use this webinar thing? So top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a white arrow pointing to the right on an orange background. That enables you to open and close the control bar. And within there are the features that you can operate and to use. And what I'd like you to first of all be comfortable with is that we are recording this webinar, and that will be circulated to all attendees within 1 week if you want to refer back to it. And we may distribute that recording to a wider audience. Please could you use the questions tools which you'll see in your control bar to ask any questions. If you highlight those, effectively that will go through to the administrator, who will pass it out to any of the speakers. Now, we're looking to try and do Q&A towards the back end or at the end of each of the sections, but there may be an opportunity now and again to try and clear some of those questions, and that will be up to the speaker. They'll bring those questions out and try and answer them for you. But there will be at the back end of this a final Q&A, so if there's any further questions, please just let us know. Now, I guess that sort of just opens the door. If there are any questions about the administration or the process that we're using for housekeeping around the webinar, please let us know now. We seem to be okay, so what I'm going to do is carry on, and if we have to go back to that, we will do so. So further on to Stop and Think, as I say, this think tank, 5 people, been working very hard at trying to understand the implications, and our simple mission statement to Stop and Think was to effectively be very realistic in our views, to say it as it is, to back that up with appropriate statistical evidence, and where it is conjecture, to say so. It isn't a sales spin, so none of this is about selling either Changestone or Opale. It is a realistic summary of the views of those organizations. We agreed to openly share all of that information, the predictions, the findings, and the solutions with all, and I guess this is part of that process. For some of you, you'll already have been following our weekly messages. We've been putting out 1 to 2 messages a week on a specific topic, quite crisp, quite direct, and quite forthright, and that has led us to opening to webinars to discuss each of those particular concepts or views in more detail. Now, we've done a lot of work for today's webinar, and it focuses on effectively 4 things, although we were going to cover service levels, but have decided to move that to a separate webinar, which will happen in the not too distant future. So we intend to go through a bit of a context, and it will be a UK context for COVID-19. The term space segmentation, what do we mean, and what does it mean to the wider property portfolios, occupancy viability and occupancy risk. Now, in the UK, there's a great deal of discussion around risk assessments before return to work. This is our take on what the assessments should be prior to taking up occupation. And there is no doubt that there has been quite a large focus on people working from home. We wanted to discuss that in some detail with you guys to make sure that the view of what is working from home and the difference between working from home and home working is understood, but the implications of it. At the moment, everyone's been thrust into the space of go work from home unless you can't, and that seems to be driving people's views, but there's a lot more to it. Let's talk about the COVID-19 context. Now, it looks a bit complex, this slide, but I think it covers all of the points. There's a view from the government in the UK, which I've covered off at the top there. We have looked at that position from the government. We came up very quickly with a 3-phased type process that COVID would follow, and I'll take you through that. And then looking at the behaviors that we're seeing from the market in each one of those phases of process. So the government's been really quite clear to start with back in the initial close down in March. They were very clear that they were going to conserve and build the NHS capacity, and they were putting effectively the economy in the UK into hibernation. Their focus was very clearly towards people welfare, and the amount of expenditure that the government has entered into to enable their thinking has been quite phenomenal. The expectation in the UK is in excess of 300 billion, and to put that into context, in 2008 the economic or banking or finance crash cost us about 89. So we have expended 3 times potentially than in 2008. And that effectively is more than we spent in the Second World War. So that's all been spent. Now, and you can even test the temperature when you're listening to news every day, we've reached the crossover point. In fact, in our views, we've surpassed the crossover point about a week or 2 weeks ago. And the crossover point is the point at which everyone starts realizing that the economic implications are as critical to the country and the welfare of the people in it as are the medical conditions that you put in place to support the people during the initial lockdown. So we've reached this crossover point, and now what we've got is a focus from the government on economic resuscitation, somehow getting the economy back to a reasonable position, but also the trading balance. We can't go slower than our European neighbours for fear of the trading imbalance starting to take a hold and having a long-term economic issue for us. So our focus, or the governmental focus, is now moving to finance, getting the economy back going, and as a result of that, they're spending much less money. Now, what we did very early on was come up with this react, stop, and recover thinking. And the react phase was real quite simple. Guys, there were rules coming in from all sorts of directions real quick. There was a change in demand coming from the businesses. There was the work from home unless you can't. So all the FM teams, real estate as well, potentially, but the FM teams, all they could possibly do was react to the latest rule or challenge, which was happening almost on an hourly basis in the early days. We then went into the process and said, look, we've reacted to everything they've told us. Now we have to start looking at things proactively. But the first phase of that, of course, is to stop spending. And that cost was phenomenal. That's to stop spending anything at all. And reduce FM spend to the lowest possible figure and seize every opportunity to slash spending, however brutal that would be. Now, within that phase, effectively, you're trying to husband the resources that you have throughout the process. And there's some very major airlines were very clear that early on they had absolutely no choice but to see if they could survive from a cash flow perspective until recovery. And in their case, they're not anticipating recovery until Q4 of 2021, not full anyway. And then once we've got past the stop phase, once we understand what it is that we're dealing with and what our start point is, we enter into the recovery phase, and that's the controlled resumption of service delivery taking place broadly from Q3 and Q4 2020, probably going all the way through into mid to end 2021. And the broad context of recover is to control the resumption of FM spend. In other words, not go straight back to what it was before, but to actually only switch on the FM spend that's broadly necessary for the business to continue to function. Now, the behaviors that we've seen in each of these phases, real clear. Everything stops for the react phase, get home, work from home, or indeed just stop working. And that's where we have a great deal of the furlough occurring and clicking in. On the stop spend, cash is king. And as soon as businesses went into cash is king, no spend, everything was stopped, and they maximized furlough. And in the UK, furlough, 80% of people's salaries have been paid, 8.3 to 9 million people on furlough, and they've only just stopped the signing up for furloughs about mid-Wednesday of last week. So all companies maximized furlough, especially in the FM supply arena. There was a huge amount of loan and grant opportunities, all of which have been seized, and those funds have been called down. Now we're going into the recover phase. Question now is how is the land going to lie? And our view is that we start seeing some releasing of funds because these behaviors aren't historical, they're predicted, and we are going to see FM services starting in a very sporadic manner. But the overall, in our view, cost reduction for FM services from an immediate perspective will be in excess of 30%. I'll explain a bit more about that later on. So the context has been really really going through the react, stop, and recover phase. And most organizations are at the end of the stop phase, moving into recover. That's sort of where the bulk of people are. But there are a number of organizations that are still very firmly in the stop phase. And very, very few could even think about professing that they have indeed recovered. So there's the context. I'm just looking to see if there's any Questions so far? No? Okay, so I'm going to move on to space segmentation. Now, space planning is a well-known thing. People, people talk about layouts of offices. They talk about, getting the best interaction between employees and groups of employees, and a great deal of time, energy, and effort is spent in dealing with that. This isn't designed. Space segmentation is not designed to take over, if you will, from longer term property and space requirements planning. This is an immediate reaction to COVID-19, the reaction that is today, and it's the recover phase around space and the allocation of space in our view. So space segmentation effectively is the redesignation and minimization of owned space. So in other words, the owned space that is owned by the business under lease or freehold, it is the reduction of that to the minimum possible space required. It is a process by which you can be proactive. So instead of waiting for the business to tell you what to save, you as FM players are proactive in running a process that can inform the business of what their options are, rather than wait to react to what the business is telling us to do. Now, the redesignation and minimization of owned space shouldn't be confused with space planning or workplace configuration. That's not what we're talking about here. And hopefully you'll pick that up as we go forward. The outcomes of the process, really its objectives, if you will, but certainly its outcomes: reduction, absolute reduction in owned space, an absolute reduced cost of space owned. So we're going to reduce the amount we have and how much it's costing us. The reality is that we are likely to end up with more space than we need and no money to pay for it. So we have to be very brutal in our view, and a very aggressive disposal of unnecessary space. So that's the outcome of this very simple process. It's in 3 phases. Oh, I've just jumped a bit there, but just to work, to give you a baseline, here are what we call the space segments. They're not designed to conflict with other views. It's just to try and batch the different space positions into a sensible array that we can work with. Obviously, vacant space speaks for itself. That's the space we do not occupy, either long-term, short-term, or medium-term. The structural and common space, this is the type of space that actually is intrinsic to the property and its design. Plant rooms are uncontrollable from our perspective, storeroom, stairs, those types of things. And common space tends to be, laid out in a structured way, and it's about the building design. Very difficult to reduce those spaces, and actually, under the demands of COVID-19, we're not going to be able to reduce the common space. Now, welfare is different, is the way we've defined it. So that includes restaurant, deli bar, games, salons, welfare, vending points, those things. That's all what we've grouped together as welfare space. Then of course you've got meeting space, which facilitates business, and you have business space. And business space could be the office if it's an office-based environment, or manufacturing hall if that's the manufacturing space, or logistics, warehousing. That's the business space. So those 3 areas in grey are what make the business and the people run. Structural is, well, we bought the building or we leased the building and it is what it is. A vacant space is the amount of that we don't need. And then you have this other thing hanging out there, which is a space segment called home working. Again, I'm not going to spoil Alan's thunder. He's going to take you through the distinctions of home working versus working from home. But broadly speaking, it is a workplace at home from which you can operate as an individual. Now, the simple phases associated with space segmentation is first and foremost understanding the demand. Now, we've got to be realistic. There is already an 11-point plus economic downturn identified in April in the UK. The chances are that's going to be between 11 and 15% by the time we exit May. By the time we've exited the overall lockdown, which could be towards the back end of July, early August, maybe later, we could be and probably will be in this position of a 30% overall initial downturn. Now, the 11 and 15% I should have said is over the 2020 as a whole, but we're going to come out much lower than that, and hopefully there will be a recovery that repositions it back. But we're looking at something in the region of a reduction in demand for businesses in terms of their product and what they sell and how they sell it, you know, as a generalized rule of around about 20 to 30%. Already we're seeing brand reductions in production, and this is real interesting. You know, when you look at the logistics side of things, you go food shopping, you want to buy pork sausages. Yes, you're going to be able to buy pork sausages, but there's only going to be one brand. There isn't going to be 15 different brands of pork sausages. So there's a reduction in how many of the different items that are being produced. Perhaps you'll be able to buy baked beans, but you won't be able to buy baked beans in curry sauce. That brand will go. Some of the brewing brands at the moment, there's 250 different brewing brands, and at the moment, the brewing process for June and July, and you can probably tell I do like my beer, but for June and July, you know, they're looking at only producing some 50 brands. So that's a much, much lower production line process, less logistics and so forth. Already mentioned, though, is 8.3 to 9 million people on furlough. That represents 30% of the working population in the UK. 1.3 was unemployed in January, and we're now talking about 3 million that are accessing benefits of one type or another in the UK. And we have no idea how many of those 8.3 to 9 million on furlough are actually going to return to employment. So the prediction that we have is unemployment will rise to about 6 million. And it's interesting that 6 million is about the size of the total public sector in the UK, which employs 5.5 million. So that'll give you a scale of what we're effectively talking about. So demand, how much of our space are we actually going to need, is something to understand and something to drive to appreciate. The spend, now, you know, again, we're going to end up with more space than we need, and we're going to end up with space we can't afford. We need to understand what it is that we can actually afford to spend in terms of housing our resources. And one of the major pieces of that is to understand the cost to income ratio that we are expecting as a business, and that will tell us how much we can afford to spend on our space. It's an input you need to understand. Again, 11 to 15% overall yearly downturn, 30% initially. These are the realities. And then there's the final piece, which is a little bit emotional, but it's true. What's the desperate truth? The CBI, the chairman of the CBI, stated last week that all of the resilience of UK businesses is on the floor, and all of the financial stability, all of the stock reserves, financial reserves that were put in place in order to exercise Brexit have been blown. So in essence, my point here is there's a desperate truth as to what it is that the business is facing. And it doesn't come down the line, you know, openly in communications, but we need to understand how desperate the business actually is, in how aggressive, and that drives how aggressively we determine space segmentation. So we're being quite, you know, blunt about where we think this is going to be looking forward. So therefore, understanding the raw truth of the position the business faces is an important proactive point for FMers. So you've identified the key sources or principles. We now need to identify the limiting factors. So it's quite easily it's quite easy to be quite right of Attila the Hun, but there are social considerations that restrict how aggressive we can be. Welfare provision. What are we actually going to provide? What are we not going to provide? Parameters of acceptability for home working. Many businesses have never really seen home working as a viable way of operating their business. They may still be in that space, don't know. But what we do know is that home working is an option, a segment of space. Therefore, by default, we need to understand the rules that govern our deployment of home working. Identify the liabilities of occupation. And this is all about the lease liabilities, the liabilities related to staff working from those locations, given the limitation of occupation. So at the moment, we've got a big bone of contention, have we not, that says 2 meters is our social distancing. There is no business in the UK or office, and there's 80% of the offices of the UK are inside the M25. There is absolutely no way are you able to occupy more than 30 to 40% of the space, especially if it is a high rise over 5 floors, you know, inside in office terms. Same potential challenges hit us, or less so, with manufacturing. So what we're saying is the liabilities of occupation are impacted by those regulations that we have to adhere to. Now, in broad terms, those regulations are 2 meters and lots of sanitizing points or hygiene points is what you're talking about, and a people flow structure to limit inside 2 meter implications. That's what it says. But everyone in the UK is fighting for 1 meter, and the reason why they're fighting for 1 meter is it's just not practical to try and open these buildings at that level. It isn't. Lease liability is important to understand also, because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, the lease liabilities are what they are, but that doesn't mean to say we can pay them. So we need to know lease and service cost liabilities to a level of real detailed knowledge. And there are currently some efforts being made around how force majeure may apply and how those may negate lease liabilities, at least for medium term. We'll cover that a little bit later. Brand, you know, some organizations from a brand perspective, brand awareness perspective, need to be in certain geographies, or they need to be of a certain style. So brand is a consideration, and the geography is a consideration also. So this is for multi-buildings, obviously for geography, but for a single building, the same principles still apply. Broadly, from a geography perspective, do we actually need to be here? Now, all of this is designed for a short-term outcome, not a long-term outcome. But once you've gone through that and you understand the principles and the limiting factors, then what we suggest is that you have a space segmentation policy, and that has some governance around it, because you are going to be taking or proposing some quite radical ways of reducing that own space. I'm just going to pause there, just check if there's any questions coming through. No, so we can comfortably carry on. So phase 2. So we've done phase 1, which is all our definitions and understanding the rules. Then we're going to examine the space that we've got and effectively take the current space position, and then by effectively leveraging home working and variable owned space and the reduction of welfare space, we are going to reduce the amount of space that is owned or has to be paid for. Now, there's one piece that flies against that, which will be the implication of PPE collection or disposal points and points of sanitation, which does affect, in terms of common areas, but also a bit of welfare. How does that actually achieve? You know, there's an upward pressure to enable those processes to occur. But, you know, people planning, sticking, you know, processes on walls and rules and sticking black plastic masking tape on the floor to try and control 2 meters. Guys, you know, that is an implementational issue. The issue initially to start with is we shouldn't be occupying it if we don't need it. That's the more critical, in our view, the more critical focus. So you effectively end up with a lot less owned space. Now, there is something called variable owned, and I'm bringing this to your attention because in a lot of businesses that are office-based, there is the opportunity not to have meeting space in the owned space. You buy meeting space when you need it. So those are capabilities that you buy as a variable cost, bought as and when, and by applying that, you may further reduce the amount of space that you need to ultimately occupy. So reducing this, the enabling tactic of reducing welfare space speaks for itself. Closing restaurants and all gathering points. It is now, you know, a working environment. It is not necessarily viable. Well, it isn't necessarily viable to provide restaurant services. Oh, we don't think you should do it anyway, at least in the period of the recover phase. You may do that in the long term, but right now, these are nice to haves, but they also create gathering points which cause potentially wider infections. There will be a requirement for PPE collection and disposal points. Don't forget that. That's going to impact upwards on the common areas, probably. Home working, again, don't want to steal Alan's thunder, but broadly speaking, home working allowances and a reduction in working time requirements to encourage people to work from home is clearly an approach, and it is an incentivized approach. Home working is one of the key ways of reducing the space you need to own as a business, and as I say before, variable and owned space. So you change by very aggressive reviewing from one status to another, and at that point you have to go into phase 3, and phase 3 is the releasing of the benefits. For the owned space, you're immediately going for the tactic of rent reduction. For many, that's already occurred, by the way. There are organizations that have reduced their rent liability for the next 6 months to a rent-free period by negotiating with the landlord. But it's all short term. And in some cases, it's the rent goes back on towards the back end of the lease. What we're saying is, guys, you know, again, we end up with space we can't afford. The only thing we can do is to fight to reduce that space. Change the portfolio. So, you know, segmenting changes what the amount of that you need, and that drives what vacant space I have. And what I then do with that space is to get as much of it out the door as possible. Come on to that in a minute or two. But there's also some forced, which is, you know, the space segmentation process, but there's also unforced, which is opportunistic. Do I just be the right opportunity to move? Lower cost space, moving to that, or to create welfare space in lower cost space, such as High Street. You've got years worth of rent-free coming out now for High Street and other types of variable space. There's also a trend, and it's been interesting, that people who have freehold are looking to sell and lease back in order to inject cash into the business. You know, guys, that is actually quite a desperate measure. If you are seeking to sell and lease back to release funds, but certainly there is a prominent property management business, international, that is stating that they're seeing an upturn, quite an upturn in that. It's an interesting question. So in terms of phase 3, then the releasing of the benefits, what do we do with the vacant space segment? Because broadly speaking, vacant space segment should have increased. Our view is there's no point in looking down the sublet route because it'll take too long to transact. Bearing in mind that this is a COVID-19 response. It's brutal, it's hard, it's short to medium term. It isn't about the long-term requirements of the business, because guess what? They're further down the line. So subletting may or may not work, but it's unlikely because it takes time to deal with it. Then you've got isolate, positioning here. Every element of space that you can see or that you have should be that's vacant. Sorry, confusing myself. Go entirely lights out. and you don't want to be spending any service charge money in that whatsoever. So this is as bleak as boarding it up. It isn't any longer space to consider. For that space of isolating, if you're not going to use it, try not to pay for it. So one of the tactics here is by identifying back with the landlord that it's just space you're not going to use. Going for a rent free on that space may be a viable option. Short term, it's you can turn it back on if you need to turn it back on, but this is medium term, short term requirements. Isolate. If you think that it's going to move more to a medium term position or a longer term position, then you're talking about a more permanent solution. And when I say permanent, I mean absolutely permanent. So there is a number of court cases currently that are looking at whether force majeure enables us to release ourselves from lease. And there are more prominent activities around that. So force majeure says, look, we're not going to go back into this space, guys, certainly not for a reasonable period of time. And we would say 2 to 3 years. Then you just want to hand the keys back, is the thinking. Obviously, if it's temporary, say, look, I am probably going to grow back into it. Maybe you go for a longer term rent-free period, but 6 months will not enable the businesses to reposition themselves effectively. We have to have an aggressive approach for 12 months minimum, probably 18 months, and that's if a vaccine becomes viable. So space segmentation, 3 phases. Definitions and limitations to understand, or principles and limitations to understand, where we truly are as a business proactively, what limitations we have to apply to our thinking, and then you're attacking your space, and attacking is the right aggressive word, to effectively maximize the amount of vacant space. Once you've maximized the vacant space, you're isolating, entirely lights out mode, and you're handing back to landlord. That's in broad terms the space segmentation approach. Now, as I say, 30% reduction in demand. We don't know how many people are we going to have to accommodate. So we know that there's going to be a pretty clear position where we have far more space than we need to accommodate the staff that we have, but also far more than we can afford. I'm just looking to see if there is any questions. No. Oh, yes, sorry. I'm just going to pick this question up, if I may. On vacant, as well as you still have so on vacant space as well, you have a maintenance liability. Though that's true, what we're saying is you board it up and you go lights out. So there will be a very minimum, well, the idea is your minimum service cost possible. And lights out means exactly that. We're not maintaining or looking after this space to reoccupy, certainly not in the short term. Yeah, so they'll be spending a little bit, but very, very little. And if you can get away with it, spend none. And there are techniques now that say, do you know what? Do I run the risk and I just don't spend in that space? And maybe that's viable to do so. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, and Derek's now come on screen. So thank you for that, and we'll speak soon. Derek, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. And good morning, everyone. My name's Derek Winton. I'm an analyst with Opale, working with the Stop and Think team just now. I'm going to do 15 minutes on occupancy viability and occupant risk, or OVOR, as we're calling it. Before I start, just a quick note, just to reiterate some of the points that Neil made about the context. We're talking about occupancy and occupation strictly in the near-term future with the context of COVID-19. So we're in a situation now where there are lots of people furloughed or working at home, working from home, to be discussed later. And we've got many buildings partially occupied or completely unoccupied, apart from skeleton staff. But things are changing rapidly. Just this morning, I know we've got someone from New Zealand on the line. There was another couple of cases of COVID appeared in New Zealand. It looks so far like they're limited, but things could change rapidly. Similarly, in the UK, we have a current rule of 2 meters. That may change to 1 meter. If we get a second spike, it may change back. So we're not talking about any permanent changes, at least as far as this process goes. And the last point is that it's not for everyone. Some businesses are doing very well out of this crisis, but most of them, as Neil said, are struggling in terms of cash flow. So that being the case, as I say, we're looking at short-term flexible solutions. And so to sum this up, we've said, can we spend £1 this week to get 5 back next week? That's the order of magnitude that we're looking at in terms of cost. So with that in mind, we're looking at 2 fundamental questions. First one, should I occupy a building if it's currently unoccupied, and how? Now, the reason I've got the 2 arrows there is that the 2 questions can lead from one to the other and back again. So if you make the decision that you want to occupy, then you start planning how, and it turns out that it's unviable, and then you go back to whether you should occupy again. And it's easy to get stuck in a loop there. And what we found is that a lot of people just go straight to the operational level of we're doing what we did before, but with fewer people, more spaced apart, and it's, as Neil says, tape on the floor, arrows telling you where to walk. So what we tried to set out here is a simple process that takes a more strategic helicopter view to answering those questions before you get into the operational level. Now, I said simple. This diagram does not look particularly simple, but by the end of this presentation, I'm sure it will appear a lot more simple. If you look on the left-hand side, so I won't go into detail just now, but I will by the end of the presentation. The left-hand side really shows that it's a 4-stage model of information capture, decide a strategy, generate options, and then pick an option and eliminate them. So let's set that out here. So what I'll do over the course of 10 slides, so not too many, is go through each of these in turn, and then stitch them all together at the end, and then go back to that diagram, which will hopefully look a little bit less complicated. So stage 1, the information capture stage. What we've done here is to set out a framework for what you might call lenses with which to view the business, or through which to view the business. And we're looking for relevant information. So it can be a bit intimidating. So what is relevant information in the COVID situation? So if you look at it through these lenses, you can start to identify relevant information. So we've got lots of P's. We're still trying to come up with another P that means constraints. So if anyone has any ideas for that, we came up with prelims yesterday. I'm quite convinced on that one. But in terms of what goes into these boxes, I've populated some ideas here, but this isn't an exhaustive list. We do have more thinking behind this, but we don't have the time in the 15 minutes to go into this in detail. But in summary, a lot of the portfolio issues are the kind of thing that Neil's already talked about. So when you do that analysis, you'll have a better idea of the priorities of your business and the different space segments. And you will also have an idea of your current lease obligations and what options you have there. In terms of the process side of things, this may be thinking that you've already done. So if you have a business continuity plan or a business recovery plan, hopefully you will have identified the critical processes and the key people as well, so it feeds into both. So it may just be a case of revisiting those existing documents. Also your long-term business plan, obviously worth revisiting that given the current situation, but it may well steer the thinking in terms of reoccupation. Another thing worth considering is the constraints on what you may hope to achieve. Certainly in terms of working from home, that will be determined by the situation that people are in. Again, in the UK, Most schools, are pretty much all of them, are still off, so people are at home with their kids, which can have an impact on working from home. But I won't go too much into that because I know Alan's going to cover that later. The right-hand side, we'd recommend looking at existing performance metrics that you use for your business, because these will come in handy to identify what are the best options going forward. So these will be the measure by which you judge the different options that you come up with later. Just a little point of clarification on the right there, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. I think you said this, it's effective to crack a nut with a sledgehammer, but it's not very efficient. And depending on the situation that you're in as a business, will depend on which of those are more important. If, for example, you're a brewer and you're experiencing a huge surge in demand for supermarkets, you may just want to get as much done as quickly as possible and then worry about efficiency later, whereas most other businesses are in an efficiency situation at the moment. So having done that, we move on to stage 2. So we now hopefully will have a better idea of what is the most important, or what are the most important things to achieve in terms of getting people and processes back into action. As I said, we'll have measures in place in terms of how we'll judge which option to pursue. A quick note on that, there is a thorny question in terms of productivity, which has been notoriously difficult to measure over the years, and people have different approaches. We do have some thinking around that, so if anyone would like to know more about that, then let us know after the webinar. The third point in terms of risk strategy is an important point to consider, and there are 2 elements of this. The first is, are you the kind of business that adopts the risk yourself, or do you push it out to your employees? And that will be different for different businesses. So for example, if you are a school or a hospital or a care home, as we're finding out, you may want the organization to take as much care as possible to minimize the risk to it. Whereas if you're dealing with executives, adults, you may decide that it's more effective to essentially say, here are the hand sanitizers, you know where they are, use them. There's only one person in a lift, and we're going to rely on you to manage that. Whereas conversely, you might decide you have someone making sure that these rules are followed. So one decision to make in terms of risk. The other one is how you will balance risk going forward in terms of COVID-19. So you may decide that co-locating key members of staff might present unacceptable risk in terms of the risk of cross-infection, as in putting all your eggs in one basket, for want of a better term. So again, issues to consider before we move on to the next stage, which is the configuration options. Now, this is where you get creative, but having said that, the first option always has to be do nothing, because if it turns out that all the options that we produce end up costing more than the benefits that they produce, then it will always be more sensible to do nothing. The options, as I say, it may be worth here considering things other than just going back to what we were doing before, but more spaced out. You may find, we had a couple of examples here where if you have a floor of desks and some relatively small meeting rooms, you might find that those meeting rooms are now unviable given the social distancing regulations. And if those meeting rooms are absolutely vital to your business, if you're in a creative industry, for example, it may be more cost effective for you to strip out all the desks from an entire floor and use that as a meeting space, for example. Similarly, if we can only occupy up to 30% of occupation, it may make sense to do 3 8-hour shifts. For example, it probably won't be a popular choice, but it may be a necessary choice in terms of the survival of the business. So, as I say, getting creative here is going to give us a lot more scope in terms of ways out of this. The diagram there showing the arrows both ways is that each of those configuration options, you would then go into a certain level of detail. So you would have your floor plans, any procedures, any extra resources that you would need to employ. And then you would measure that against the risk assessment strategy that you've defined in step 2, in terms of who owns the risk and which groupings are at most risk, etc. Another thing I didn't mention there is the risk to employees in terms of those who might be shielding or those who are in vulnerable groups. Might be worth doing a survey, if you haven't already, of your workforce to find out what their situations are in that respect. So having done that, we now hopefully will have a series of possible options that we could pursue. And we then move into the cost benefit analysis. So the cost section, relatively straightforward. We're talking about financial costs, although there may be other impacts. So for example, if you find that a building is key to your brand presence, not occupying that building may have a reputational cost. In terms of the benefit side, there will be hopefully the metrics that you've identified in the info capture stage, which will let you, for want of a better word, put a number on the relative benefits. But an important point to make here, this isn't a question of just plugging numbers into an equation. This is going to have to be a high level review, and at the end of the day, there's going to be some judgment involved in terms of which option to pursue. And then, so that's when we move on to the selection stage. So that was step 4. So if we move back to the diagram again, you can see that these are the elements that we've discussed. So to review, info capture at the start, getting as much relevant information as possible. And again, we suggest these categories as lenses to view the business, but use your judgment there. Then identify the strategic direction. Then generate candidate options and tune them against your risk assessment, and then move into the comparison and selection stage. If you want a slightly prettier version of that, we have the overview created by our colleague Stuart, who sadly isn't on the call today, moving through the three levels from strategic to tactical to operational to the very last stage, which is the tape on the floor, which is where a lot of people are now. So what we're suggesting is helicopter view and then work your way down. And that ends my presentation. So I will just check whether there are any questions. And there's nothing for me. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Alan. And you should have control now, Alan.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Okay, well, good morning again. We've heard from Neil and Derek about the desperate place we find ourselves, and that home working is one of those key segments of space that we need to consider in our arsenal of tools to do the job. With the restrictions imposed by COVID-19 and the government, it looks likely that we cannot accommodate a full house as before, nor can we manage the logistics of getting people to the traditional place of work. But before we see home working as a silver bullet, we need to understand what it is and how we implement it. I'm going to cover 5 topics, a bit of context about where we are, my definition of what home working is, then some stats. We all need some stats, the implications of home working, and finally the implication needs of home working. Context. Home work has been around for many years. The term cottage industry was used as an industry whose labour force consisted mainly of family units or individuals working at home using their own equipment. The textile industry is a good example: spinning, weaving, garment making, plus more cerebral activities such as writing books. The term has been subverted more recently to describe a limited but enthusiastically pursued activity or subject, such as protesting. Automation, the Industrial Revolution, changed many aspects of the industrial side, and it became more centralized, and the manufacturing works and offices came into being. Over the last 40 years or so, the application of IT, faster broadband, and the internet has allowed jobs to be delivered remotely. The move is also taking traditional paper-based processes and managing them digitally. For example, ordering and invoicing, and e-commerce has seen the decline of the high street shops. The thing to note is there are some very clever people out there that are automating these centralized processes minimize the need for manual intervention. The term robotics is now being applied to business process re-engineering and uses smart technology to do simple tasks such as invoice matching. This increased ability to work remotely, it presents a significant business opportunity. It challenges the traditional need for space, office space. So, definition. Well, first of all, there is no legal definition of working from home. I've not been able to find one, so if somebody's got one, let me know. I'd be interested in using it. But the essential feature is it's the use of information technology to enable people to work away from the office. It can apply to people working full-time, part-time, dividing their time between home and office, or mobile workers. What is home working and what is working from home? What's the difference? Let's have a look at the attributes that I see. So working from home, pretty straightforward. It's at home and working. It's not your usual place of work. It's an immediate reaction, maybe temporary. It will probably be poorly equipped. Be at your dining room table, laptop on knees, any ad hoc arrangement, and it's probably your home broadband. One watch point in working from home, there are potential employee welfare bombshells, time bombs out there. We're getting reports of people getting very stressed working at home, and I've heard of a couple of suicides, and some people have demanded to go back to work because they can't work at home. On the other side, home working, as defined by me, this is I've been a home worker for many years now, in a variety of businesses. It's my place of work. It's a piece of dedicated space. It's fully equipped, DSE compliant, the right chair, the right desk, the right screens, the right heights, everything's working really well. A good cyber secure broadband connection, and I'm fully supported by the business, which is really important. It's isolated from the rest of the house. It's actually my spare room. It's or it could be a separate building, or it might be some new space. We could actually look at alternative ways of providing home working, maybe not in your home, but maybe outside of your home, a pod in the garden, otherwise known as a shed. Or it could be you get some space in a local shop, retail area, or a local rugby club. It's a long-term working provision, which isn't based in the corporate office. Okay, some stats. We can't have a presentation without some stats. They always worry me because they can be twisted and used in different ways. Sorry, interpreted in many ways. This is an overview of home working as presented by the Office of National Statistics report. It was published in March of this year, and it looks at what was going on in January to December 2019. The workforce was 32.5 million people at the time, of which 1.7 million, 5.1% of the workforce worked at home, in their own home. Another, just over 4 million, 12.4%, had worked at home or from home in the previous week. But an interesting stat there for me is that there's near 9 million who have worked at home at some time, 20%, 27% of the working population. I'm not quite sure what the next stat was all about, but I've left it in there because it's in the chart. Same ground, building as home, nearly 3 million, 9.1% of the workforce. An interesting stat that's missing from that is actually the 28 million people, right, 85% of the workforce, that are working somewhere else, not at or linked to home, which to me means that there are 15% of workforce are potentially home workers already, which is approaching 5 million people. Okay, let's move ahead now. So what does it look like post-COVID-19 lockdown? This is an extract from a YouGov survey taken in May, 7 weeks in or so to the lockdown. We need to be aware that YouGov is an independent market research group and will put a political slant on things, but it's a good reference point and shows the trends. Neil's numbers really indicate that things have progressed since then, and the announcement today in the UK of another 612,000 people not employed is starting to show some of the trends. It's a busy chart, so let me help. The left-hand side is essentially the same information that you saw on the previous slide. It's the ONS stuff. There's a difference. My 85% not home working is their 73%. And that's because they've managed the 9 million that have worked from home. It's slightly different to make their 27%. Okay, the right-hand side is a view of where they saw the place of work in May of this year. 38%, let's work our way down it, 38% are working from home. Another 8% are working from home at some time. That's 46% of the working population is now working from home. 23% work somewhere else. 31% are not working. They're either furloughed or they've lost their job. That means the current working population is only 69% of what it was in 2019, about 22.5 million people. 2/3 of that are currently working from home. Quite a staggering thought. The future, as Neil's already said, is unknown. How many of those furloughed will get back to work? Potentially half the working population could be home workers or working from home in the current definition. So what's the impact of COVID-19 been on the provision of home working? Well, first of all, historically, there's been quite a lot of animosity between employers and employees about working at home, or some employers call it shirking at home. But essentially, there's a growing realization now that home working is viable. It's an attractive alternative for both employers and employees. Employers because it drives costs down, and employees because they get some benefits from it. The introduction of long-term home working is a good tactical and operational solution to the business. It comes out of the OR process. Implementing it is really important. This is where I believe we need to really think about what it's like. We need to respond quickly to aid the recovery process. It needs to be part of the whole business strategy, back to OR again, but it needs to be managed properly. Program managed and multidisciplinary team, investment to address key areas and key issues, and release the potential savings quickly. Home working requires a rapid cultural change. It's almost, you can compare it to the Industrial Revolution. It needs to be implemented quickly, and it is cultural change in the way people work. I've kept this very, it looks a busy slide, but I've kept it very simple. The implications are ever, keep it simple, 4 Ps, people, process, portfolio, and performance. This is a cultural change, and the key is people. 3 key factors. As employers, we've got a duty of care, so health and well-being, and managing a virtual workforce is quite different. No longer management by site, in an office and visible. We need to incentivize staff, and what's it for the employee, and what are the contractual arrangements. There's a couple of enablers in there as well. Portfolio, basically new or modified ways of working, and secure systems. Home working is the largest growing segment of space. It needs investment to create the right sort of space, the appropriate working environment for the future. Finally, performance, a real challenge. Derek's already mentioned it. Whilst there are many thoughts around on how you can measure performance, the reality is there are no real benchmarks for efficiency today. Well, we need to develop new ways of measuring performance for home workers. So, summarising, home working is a long-term tactical enabler, managing corporate space needs through the overall process. Currently, there is some alignment of employer and employee objectives. The important thing when driving a cultural change program is the drivers of change tend to be corporate, about the business. Resistance of change tends to be about the people. At the moment, what we can see is ways of incentivizing people to actually work from home. We talked about the home working allowance, and we can talk about actually being a much better work-life balance. It is a significant cultural change. It requires investment by program management, but we need to act now to realize savings in the corporate home space segment. That's my pot. Any questions?
So that's more generally, and I can see a couple of questions here. One of them is talking about, do we have a view on the opportunity to work with offshore or outsourced teams? And the simple answer is the ability to push demand somewhere else is always going to be an option, providing where you're pushing it to hasn't got the same challenges as you have yourself. And don't forget that we're going to be pushing 30% less demand down those pipes. Now, at the moment, therefore, one of the biggest concerns that we can see, certainly for offshoring, is the fact that, you know, the organization that you have a partnership with from an offshoring perspective is not in a position to provide the service, and therefore by default you have to take that demand back internally. Part of your space segmentation, it's demand related. Do you need it? Don't you need it? From an outsource perspective, you know, the supply chain, and I'm assuming this term is not about FM outsourcing, but outsourcing more generally. Again, it goes back to, are they in a space to deliver your requirement, or are they not? Are they able to face off to your demand, or are they not? I think the biggest challenge at the moment is there is going to be 30% less demand going down the pipe, and I think that is the major commercial issue for us all. And for companies, bearing in mind that most companies don't make that in margin, you're gonna, you know, that is where it hits, and it will hit the outsourced supply chain as well. From an FM outsourced perspective, predominantly labor. What I would say is that from the evidence we have, the amount of FM related labor that's been furloughed is quite high. And we're talking about 70–80% of the total blue collar resources of certain suppliers have actually been furloughed. How many of those come back depends in broad terms on the client demand for their services, which is knocked on the basis that we actually don't need to open the building, or we need to open less of the building. And therefore, there's going to be a significant impact on the turnover of the supply chain more generally. I hope that one answers your question. Have I got any more questions there? I don't think so. Is there questions for Alan in there, Derek, that I can't see?
Question for Alan, which was, is there any evidence of reduced creativity as a result of home working, from Sue Murray?
I've only got some small evidence of it. A colleague, an old friend of mine, runs a games design company, and they've got about 200 games developers who used to sit in a warehouse in Guildford. Since COVID-19, they've actually all been sent home to work with their bits and pieces, and he's actually seen an increase in productivity by giving them the freedom to work when they want to. Essentially, a lot of home workers actually work 24/7. They don't have rigid hours. They work when they need to work. So, and it swings and roundabouts. You know, that's the only evidence I got of more efficient working and higher productivity.
I mean, it's anecdotal, I think, if I could add to that. I think it's anecdotal. And as Alan said earlier, there isn't a performance measure that is applied to an office-based environment. You know, productivity means this, and we are measuring our resources when they're based in an office on that metrics. And therefore, because we haven't got a baseline that says that's what productivity looked like in January for us, we have no way of statistically analyzing productivity from a home working perspective. What I think there is plenty of anecdotal evidence now for is that working from home on a long-term basis starts off with a very excited community, working from home community, with all of the thrills of the freedom it gives them for a good couple of weeks. But you come to the third and the fourth week, and we're starting to find it very challenging to try to operate from, as Alan put it, the dining room table with the rugrats chewing at our ankles for dinner. So those things, you know, but we don't have a mechanism of measuring the productivity rate. Our belief is that productivity in working from home regime has been significantly lower than normal office-based working. But if it was all home working with the appropriate workplace, There's no evidence to suggest that creativity or productivity would be impacted by that. Actually, in some ways, look at the stop and think process. You know, we are not sharing offices. So everything that we've published, everything that we've done, the contents of this webinar and the thinking behind it has actually been done remotely. So it's possible with the right facilities to be as productive is our view, but there's no stats to prove one way or another whether it is being so now. I can't see any more questions, Derek.
No.
So do you know what? I think what we'll say is thank you all very much for joining us. We will be doing a number of other webinars related to, you know, traditional FM thinking is dead, because we believe it is. And the next one will focus on the service levels, and I think it will probably also answer a question we've had earlier, which is, you know, the reduction of services. You know, even if it's vacant space, we still have to deliver some services. And I think the service level webinar will help determine exactly what that level of service should be, therefore in comparison terms what the cost was versus what it is today. But the overriding message of this webinar is for us all to understand that we are going to end up with more space than we need, and we are going to end up with no money to pay for it. And that means that we have to focus more aggressively as an FM group, as a real estate group, and be more proactive to provide our business partners, you know, our bosses, our business, with options that are far more aggressive than has historically been the case. And there's very little room for maneuver. So once again, thank you all for your time, much obliged, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.